Imagine pulling something out of the ground and not being able to explain it. Not because it's broken or incomplete, but because it's perfect. A bronze face staring back at you with enormous protruding eyes, ears that flare wide like they were built to hear frequencies we can't reach, a mouth set in an expression that doesn't quite map onto any emotion you can name. You're holding it. It's real. It's thousands of years old, and it shouldn't exist. Not here. Not like this. Not this good. That's the situation archaeologists found themselves in when the site of Sanxingdui, buried in the Sichuan basin of southwestern China, began giving up its secrets. And the more it gave, the harder the questions got. Here's what makes this so strange. We have a fairly detailed picture of early Chinese civilization. The story usually centers on the Yellow River Valley, on the Shang dynasty, on oracle bones and jade, and a recognizable thread of culture that runs more or less continuously into the China we know today. That's the dominant narrative. That's the version that made it into the history books. But Sichuan, deep in a mountain-ringed basin hundreds of miles to the southwest, wasn't supposed to be part of that story. Not at this level. Not with bronze casting of this sophistication. Not with ceremonial objects this strange and this large and this unlike anything else found anywhere in the ancient world. And yet, buried in ritual pits deliberately placed and then covered over, someone left behind bronze masks with eyes that push outward from the face like telescopes. They left standing figures nearly 5 feet tall. They left trees made of bronze hung with jade and bronze birds. They left gold objects pressed onto faces like masks within masks. Whoever did this was not struggling with early metallurgy. Whoever did this had mastered it, pushed it to places nobody else was going at the same time, and then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, stopped. The culture vanished. The site went silent. And for something like 3,000 years, almost nobody talked about it. That silence is one of the most interesting things about Sanxingdui. It's not just that the culture ended, which cultures do. It's that it ended without leaving behind the thing that most ancient civilizations leave behind. No writing, no texts, no inscriptions on the bronze, no records carved into stone, no accounts passed down in documents we can trace. The people who made these objects, who built a walled city in the basin, and buried their most sacred things in carefully arranged pits, did all of that without a written language we've been able to identify. Or if they had one, it hasn't survived. Which means everything we know about them comes from the objects themselves, and the objects raise more questions than they answer. Why were the pits filled deliberately? This wasn't looting, wasn't destruction by conquest, wasn't the random scatter of a city burned in a raid. The objects were placed. Some were burned first. Some were laid in specific orientations. Someone made a decision, probably more than once, to take the most extraordinary things their culture had produced and put them in the ground. We don't know why. We have theories and we'll get into them, but we don't know, and that uncertainty is worth sitting with, because it means we're looking at a decision-making process we can't read. A ritual logic that made complete sense to the people performing it and remains almost opaque to us. Then there's the question of how this culture fits into the broader story of early China, or whether it fits at all. The Sichuan basin is geographically isolated, mountains on almost every side, the Yangtze cutting through, the climate wetter and more humid than the northern plains. The bronze working tradition at Sanxingdui shares some materials and some techniques with the Shang dynasty to the north and east, but the objects themselves look nothing like Shang bronzes. The aesthetic is completely different. The proportions, the imagery, the scale of certain pieces, all of it points somewhere else, somewhere we haven't mapped yet. That question of whether Sanxingdui represents a parallel civilization that developed largely on its own, or a branch of something connected to the Yellow River cultures, or something else entirely, is still genuinely open. And it matters, Because the answer changes what we think we know about how complex societies emerged in ancient China. It might not have been one story. It might have been several, running at the same time in different directions with different results. The moment everything changed for modern understanding of this site was 1986. That's when 2 sacrificial pits were found in quick succession, packed with objects that rewrote the scale of what Sanxingdui was. We'll get into exactly what was in those pits, and what the excavation looked like, and why the bronze heads in particular stopped researchers cold. But for now, just hold the image. Bronze faces coming out of the earth, eyes designed to see something we can't see. A culture sophisticated enough to cast them and quiet enough to vanish almost without a trace. If you're listening to this right now and starting to feel that particular kind of calm that comes from a genuinely strange puzzle, I'm glad. Tell me where you are and what time it is there. I check the comments, and there's something I find quietly wonderful about this showing up in someone's earphones in Osaka at midnight, or in Melbourne on a Sunday morning. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. And if you'd like to listen without ads and without background music, you can follow the show on Spotify. It's free, it's clean, and it helps keep this going. The link to support the channel is in the description. Now, let's go to Sichuan. Let's start at the beginning of a story that was hidden underground for 3,000 years and see what's actually there. If you want to understand Sanxingdui, you have to understand the place first, because the place is doing a lot of work here. The Sichuan basin sits in the southwestern interior of what is now China, surrounded on almost every side by serious geography. To the west, the Tibetan plateau rises dramatically, some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. To the north, the Qinling and Daba mountain ranges form a natural wall between the basin and the Wei River Valley. To the east and south, more mountains, more ridgelines, more of the kind of landscape that slows everything down, trade, migration, the movement of ideas, movement. All of it gets filtered through those barriers. Inside that ring, though, the basin itself is generous. The climate is mild and wet, heavy with humidity for much of the year. The kind of place where the sky can feel low and close, and the rivers run full. 2 rivers matter most here, the Min and the Tuojiang, both tributaries that feed eventually into the Yangtze, and both running through the heart of the ancient settlement zone. The site of Sanxingdui sits near where those waterways converge, which tells you something. People in the ancient world didn't build their major centres by accident. They built them where water moved and where water could be managed. That geography created conditions for a distinct development. Not isolation exactly, because complete isolation doesn't produce the kind of sophisticated material culture we find at Sanxingdui. You need exchange for that. You need outside input. But selective contact, filtered exchange, the kind where a culture absorbs what it wants from outside influences and does something recognizably its own with it. The mountains aren't a wall, they're a membrane. Things get through, but slowly, and transformed in the process. The ancient name for this region was Shu, and Shu wasn't a footnote. It was a cultural sphere, a zone of practice and identity, and probably political organization that existed alongside the more northerly centers of early Chinese civilization, rather than simply beneath them. The texts that do mention Shu, and there are some, though they come later and need to be handled carefully, describe it as a place with its own rulers, its own ceremonial traditions, its own way of doing things, not a provincial outpost, a parallel world. The difficulty is that the textual tradition in early China is centered almost entirely on the Yellow River Valley. The Shang dynasty, which flourished roughly from around 1600 BCE until around 1046 BCE, left behind oracle bones, inscriptions, a recoverable written record that allows historians to work with it directly. The Zhou dynasty that followed left even more, and because that written tradition survived, because it was copied and preserved and eventually became the foundation of what scholars studied for centuries, the Yellow River heartland became the default center of the story, the cradle, the origin point, the place where Chinese civilization began. That framing isn't wrong exactly. The Yellow River Valley really was a major center of early complex society in this part of the world, but it can create a kind of tunnel vision where other regions only matter when they appear in relation to that center. When Shu shows up in later texts, it tends to show up as a distant territory, a place that was eventually brought into larger political frameworks, not as a place that had been doing remarkable things on its own terms, centuries before anyone from the north was paying attention. Sanxingdui complicates that picture significantly. Current dating places the main period of activity at the site within the 2nd millennium BCE, broadly speaking, with the most spectacular phase of the culture falling somewhere between roughly 1700 and 1100 BCE, though the exact ranges are still refined as new analysis comes in. That puts it squarely in the Bronze Age, contemporaneous with the Shang, not before it, not long after it. These were not sequential civilizations, they were simultaneous ones, different regions, different material traditions developing at the same time, and that simultaneity matters because it opens up a different kind of question, not just where did Chinese civilization come from, but how many centers were generating complexity at the same time, and what was the relationship between them. The Shang had their bronze ritual vessels and their oracle bone divination. Shu at Sanxingdui had something that shared a few features with that world, but was aesthetically and conceptually doing something quite different. The raw material of bronze, the alloying of copper and tin, some elements of the ceremonial function of metal objects, these threads connect the two zones. But the objects themselves sit in completely different visual universes. Think about what Shang bronzes look like. Vessels, mostly. Containers for food and wine used in ancestor rituals, decorated with geometric patterns and stylized animal motifs that follow consistent conventions, recognizable, systematic. Part of an aesthetic tradition you can trace through time. Now set that next to a Sanxingdui bronze mask with eyes that project outward from the face by several inches, ears spread wide, a scale that dwarfs almost anything being cast anywhere else in the ancient world at that moment. The same material, completely different imagination. This is why some researchers prefer to talk about early China not as a single cradle, but as what gets called an interaction sphere, a network of regional cultures that were in contact with each other to varying degrees, sharing some practices and technologies while maintaining distinct local identities. Sanxingdui is one node in that network, an unusual node, given its geographic setting and its extraordinary material culture, but a node that was connected, not hermetically sealed. That's where the interesting questions start. Not is this Chinese or not Chinese, which is actually a somewhat anachronistic framing for the 2nd millennium BCE, but rather, what was the specific texture of the relationship between the Sichuan basin and the Yellow River world? How much did they know about each other? What moved between them? What was kept separate, deliberately or by circumstance? And why does Sanxingdui, with all its sophistication, all its evident organizational capacity, all its remarkable output, look so unlike anything around it? The basin shaped the people shaped what they made. And what they made is sitting in museum cases right now, still projecting those enormous bronze eyes outward, still waiting for someone to explain what they were looking at. Long before anyone was talking about Sanxingdui culture, before lecture halls and documentaries and museum lighting, the ground was already trying to tell the story. Farmers in the Sichuan basin had been turning up odd things for a long time. Bits of worked stone, the occasional piece of jade that didn't quite look like the ones people were used to seeing, sherds of pottery with unfamiliar textures or patterns. In an old landscape with deep history, that sort of thing is not unusual. Ploughed fields are full of the past. Most of it never makes it past the edge of the village, but every so often an object is strange enough or beautiful enough that it doesn't just get tossed aside. In 1929, near the town of Guanghan, north of today's Chengdu, a group of farmers were digging an irrigation ditch. Accounts differ in the details. Some later retellings have them cutting through a pit wall. Others have them simply following the line of the ditch until their tools hit something harder than usual. But contemporary reports agree on the essentials. The earth gave way, and out came objects that had no business being in a rice field. Jades, mostly. Kong-shaped tubes, blade-like pieces, and other forms that local people recognized as valuable, but not as part of any living tradition. Some were sold, some were traded. Some found their way into the hands of dealers who brought them to Chengdu and beyond. A few made it into collections where their existence was at least recorded. By the standards of a modern excavation, it was a salvage operation with no context. By the standards of the time, it was just one more instance of the old world pushing up into the new. Those 1929 finds did get noticed. A teacher from a nearby school, Yan Daocheng, is often mentioned in Chinese language accounts as one of the first to realize that the scattered jades might point to something larger. Local officials were informed. A short field visit was organized. Some artifacts were purchased or collected. Notes were taken. The site was marked in a general way. But then the wider world intruded. The late 1920s and 1930s in China were not a time when provincial archaeology in Sichuan could easily command sustained attention. Political instability, war with Japan, and the basic difficulties of communication and logistics in a mountainous interior province all worked against any systematic follow-up. The objects from Guanghan entered the vague category of curious antiquities. Interesting, suggestive, not yet revolutionary. From a modern perspective, this is one of those moments that feels like the beginning of a story whose significance no one present could fully see. Archaeologically, scattered surface finds behave like that. A farmer's field yields a jade here, a bronze fragment there. A riverbank erodes to expose potsherds. Local people collect what seems worth keeping, and the rest stays in the soil. To an outsider, each of these events looks trivial. To someone paying close attention, they start to form a pattern. That pattern is what archaeologists look for. A single artifact tells you almost nothing on its own. It might be an heirloom, carried far from where it was made. It might have been dropped centuries after it was first used. It might have been moved by floods, by construction, by the kind of landscape processes that quietly rearrange the upper layers of the earth. But when you start to see concentrations, multiple objects of similar style, material and date emerging from a limited area, that is when the possibility of a major site comes into view. In the decades after 1929, that is what began to happen around Guanghan. More jades turned up. Pottery fragments with thick, dark pastes and particular rim shapes appeared in reports. A few bronzes of unfamiliar forms surfaced in the antiquities trade. Archaeologists working in Sichuan, when they could, took note. The name that gradually attached to the area was Sanxingdui, literally 3-star mound, a reference to 3 low rises on the landscape that local people had long known. Early surveys, especially those carried out in the late 1930s, and then again after the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, began to map what lay beneath and between those mounds. Field teams walked the ploughed surfaces, collecting every artifact fragment they could find, plotting distributions, sketching topography. They noticed that cultural material, pottery, stone tools, bits of jade, was not confined to a single point, but spread over several square kilometres of slightly raised ground near an old channel of the Yazi River, itself a branch off the Mintuo system. This is what we now call the Sanxingdui site, a broad, low terrace near Guanghan, framed by watercourses ancient and modern, studded with zones of denser and sparser finds. Later excavations would identify what appear to be residential areas, rammed earth walls and ritual zones. But in those early survey years the picture was blurry. A large settlement site was the cautious phrase that appeared in reports. Large, because the scatter of material suggested significant human presence. Settlement, because nothing yet looked like a single isolated tomb. From this kind of evidence, archaeologists can say some things with reasonable confidence. They can estimate relative density. More sherds and tools per square metre usually means more intensive or longer occupation. They can identify general cultural affiliations by comparing pottery styles and stone tool types with material from better dated sites. They can propose a rough time window. In the case of Sanxingdui, these comparisons quickly flagged the 2nd millennium BCE as the most likely horizon. But there is also a clear boundary to what can be concluded from surface and chance finds alone. Without sealed archaeological contexts, layers of soil that can be tied to specific phases of activity, fine-grained chronology is out of reach. You cannot easily distinguish a centuries-long continuous occupation from a sequence of shorter episodes separated by abandonment. You cannot reconstruct architecture from a few scattered bricks. You cannot crucially understand ritual practice or social organization just by looking at the objects that happen to have survived and resurfaced. This is one reason why the 1929 discovery, important as it was, did not immediately overturn existing narratives about early China. It added data points. It hinted at something substantial in Shu, but it did not yet force anyone to redraw their mental maps. The Yellow River Valley still held the written record. The bronzes of the Shang were still the benchmark for complexity. Sanxingdui, as it was then understood, was a promising provincial site, not a challenge to the entire framework. The site sat in that ambiguous status for decades, known but not fully known, marked on specialist maps but not yet in public consciousness. Small-scale digs in the 1950s and 1960s added more details. House foundations here, pits with everyday pottery there, traces of walls that suggested organised planning, enough to confirm that Sanxingdui had been an important centre in ancient Shu. Not enough to reveal just how strange, how singular that centre had been. What everyone was missing were the pits, the places where, for reasons we still do not entirely understand, the people of Sanxingdui gathered their most extraordinary ritual objects. Bronze heads, masks, trees, gold-covered figures, and buried them deliberately. Those pits lay hidden, just metres below fields and paths locals had walked for generations. The irrigation ditch of 1929 had grazed the edges of the story without quite breaking into it. Surface surveys had traced the outline of a city without seeing into its heart. It would take another accident, in another year, 1986, to change that. In 1986, the story under the fields at Sanxingdui finally stopped hinting and started speaking in full sentences. The catalyst, again, was not some grand, pre-planned operation, but work that looked entirely ordinary from the surface. Construction, earth-moving, people reshaping the land in ways that unintentionally cut through the careful layering of the past. By this point, archaeologists knew Sanxingdui was important. They had maps, surface collections, trial trenches. The site was on the radar of provincial and national institutions. So when machinery or shovels in a promising zone began to pull up concentrations of pottery, bone, and bronze, there were eyes ready to notice, phones ready to ring, teams ready to move. What they opened in 1986 are now simply called Pit 1 and Pit 2. The names are understated. The impact was not. From the very beginning, these were not ordinary holes with stuff in them. Archaeologists quickly realized they were dealing with sealed deposits, discrete features that had been dug into earlier occupation layers, filled deliberately and then closed. In other words, not trash pits, not random accumulation, but something planned. When excavators talk about a pit context, this is what they mean. You can trace the cut of the pit walls down through the surrounding soil. You can see where natural layers are sliced by a human action, and then where the fill starts. You record the stratigraphy, the order and character of layers, centimetre by centimetre. You map the position of every major object, every fragment in 3 dimensions. Because in a context like this, placement is part of the message. Pit 1, the smaller of the two, still held more than 1,000 artifacts and fragments by the time the excavation was complete. Pit 2 held far more, several thousand objects, depending on how you count separate pieces and reconstructions. Together, the 2 pits produced a dense, bewildering archive of a world that, on paper, barely existed. The broad categories came into focus first. Bronze dominated the assemblage, not as a few scattered tools or weapons, but as an entire spectrum of ritual and decorative objects. Masks with exaggerated features, heads with stylized ears and carefully shaped eyes, vessels, weapons, fittings, and items whose functions are still debated. There was gold, too, thin sheets, foil, and coverings that had once been applied to wooden or bronze cores. Jade and stone followed, blades, tubes, ornaments that showed both local taste and echoes of longer-distance traditions. Ivory tusks appeared in quantity, suggesting access to elephants or trade networks that reached into regions where elephants lived. And then there was the way everything lay. In a simple refuse pit you expect a kind of casual chaos, broken items tossed in over time, domestic waste, mixing of everyday and occasional objects. In Pit 1 and Pit 2, the pattern was different. Bronze objects were concentrated in particular zones, jades clustered in others, ivory in thick layers. In some places, artifacts seemed carefully nested or stacked. In others, they formed dense, tangled masses where it looked as though objects had been gathered elsewhere and then dumped in all at once. The condition of the finds added another layer of strangeness. Many bronzes were broken, not just by the weight of soil or the passage of time, but in ways that suggested deliberate damage. Heads without bodies, masks with missing parts. Long objects snapped into shorter lengths, edges crushed or bent. Some pieces, especially in Pit 2, bore traces of exposure to intense heat. Surfaces reddened or blackened, deformation consistent with burning. The ivory showed similar signs. Many tusks were fragmented, scorched, or warped. Ashy lenses and charcoal flecks appeared in the fill layers between and around the larger objects. Soil chemistry and microscopic analysis pointed to fire having played a role in the sequence of events, though exactly how is still debated. None of this proves a single, simple story. Archaeologists are cautious about reading intention from breakage. Objects can shatter as they are deposited. Fires can start accidentally. But when you have thousands of artifacts concentrated in 2 pits, many of them broken or burned in patterned ways before burial, the possibility of deliberate action is hard to avoid. One way to think about it is as a choreography in multiple acts. First, the community selects particular kinds of objects: bronzes, jades, gold, ivory, prestige pieces that do not look like everyday household goods. Then, some of those objects are modified, broken, bent, exposed to fire. Whether that breaking is symbolic killing of the items, practical reduction to make them fit, or something else entirely, we cannot say with certainty. But it seems to happen before they enter the earth. Next comes the placement. In Pit 1, a succession of deposits builds up, layers of burned earth and charcoal, layers of ivory and bronze, layers of packed fill. In Pit 2, the sequence is even more complex, with what appear to be multiple episodes of deposition, separated by thin lenses of soil that had time to settle before the next wave of objects arrived. Finally, the pits are closed. Soil from elsewhere on the site is brought in, tamped down, the cut edges disappear. From the surface, after a few seasons of plant growth and weathering, the ground looks ordinary again. Underneath, though, the sealed deposits remain, protected from most later disturbance until a construction project 6 or 7 meters away, nearly 3,000 years later, happens to start peeling them open. This is what archaeologists mean by a controlled closing of a sacred space. Not sacred in any specific doctrinal sense that we can reconstruct word for word, but in the more general sense of a space set apart, used for non-ordinary actions, and then deliberately taken out of circulation. The 1986 pits at Sanxingdui look very much like that kind of space, a place where extraordinary things were gathered, transformed, and consigned to the ground under carefully staged conditions. Whether we call that ritual disposal, large-scale offering, or something else, the point is the same. These were not casual burials. For the people working in those trenches in 1986, the realization came gradually, layer by layer. At first, each new artifact was simply a surprise. Another mask, another strange head, another tangle of bronze. But as the counts rose into the thousands and the patterns of placement, stratigraphy, and damage became clearer, it was hard to avoid a quieter, more unsettling conclusion. Whoever had made these things had also chosen to hide them, not lose them, not forget them, place them. And if the pits were this dramatic, what did that say about the culture that created them, and about the world that stood above them before the final load of fill went in? To even begin to answer that, we have to look more closely at the objects themselves, the bronze heads and masks that, once they saw the light again, refused to fit neatly into anyone's existing picture of ancient China. The first thing that hits you, looking at the Sanxingdui faces, is how unapologetically not human they are. Not in the sense of monsters or demons, but in the sense of a decision. These are not portraits. They are not what people look like. They are what a certain community, in a certain time and place, decided power should look like when you give it a face. Across Pit 1 and Pit 2, and in later finds from the wider site, a kind of family resemblance emerges. The eyes push outward, as if the sockets themselves are too shallow to contain them. Sometimes they are long, tubular forms that jut forward, drilled or cast with openings that may once have held inlays. Sometimes they are more almond-shaped, still large, still assertive, still the anchor points of the whole design. The brows above them are not delicate lines. They are thick, sculpted ridges, running straight and level like beams, or arcing in long, continuous curves from temple to temple. On some masks, these brows merge into the nose in one flowing structure, giving the whole face the feel of a single, continuous plane folded into features. The ears, when present, are equally emphatic. They stand out in sharp relief from the sides of the head, often elongated with clear cartilage folds picked out in bronze. On several of the best-preserved heads, the ears are pierced, not just with a single hole, but with carefully cast loops or openings that seem designed to receive something else. Rings, pendants, maybe hanging ornaments that have long since vanished. The mouths tend to be small relative to the rest of the face, either tightly closed or only slightly parted. Lips are drawn with a single incised line or a simple thickened band. Chins can be surprisingly delicate under those strong brows, giving a sense of vertical compression. Massive upper face, compressed lower face, as if whatever mattered most about the being represented lived in the eyes and the brow. You can walk along a line of these bronzes and feel that you're seeing variations on a theme, the same grammar of exaggerated perception and attention, rephrased again and again. Scale drives the point home. Some of the bronze heads are close to life-size. A typical example might be around 30 to 35 centimeters high, 15 to 20 centimeters across, something like what you would get if you carefully measured an adult human head and then simplified the forms. These pieces feel like stand-ins for real people, if very stylized ones, but others jump categories completely. One famous head from Pit 2 is over 40 centimeters tall without its base, broad, heavy, and far more massive than any skull. When you stand near it in a museum, you are very aware that this was not meant to sit quietly on a table. It expects a pedestal, a platform, some structure that lifts it into a different visual field. The masks push scale even further. Several of the large masks from Sanxingdui are in the range of 130 to 140 centimeters wide, roughly the arm span of a small child, or about as wide as a person's shoulders. The height of these masks can approach 70 or 80 centimeters. This is not something a person could wear on a face. It would engulf them. Even mid-sized pieces in the 60 to 80 centimeter range would have been unwieldy as personal masks. Instead, they read like facades, meant to be attached to something larger, a wall, a ceremonial frame, a wooden structure, or a tall pole. Some have flanges, tangs, or perforations along the edges, the sort of practical, unglamorous details artisans include when they know an object must be fastened securely. So we have these faces, large, sometimes enormous, with exaggerated eyes and brows and ears, often with pierced lobes and patterned headdresses. How did they make them? Unlike later lost wax bronzes in other parts of the world, Chinese bronze working in the late 2nd millennium BCE is usually associated with piece mold casting. A basic way to imagine this is, you first create the shape you want in a model, often clay. You then build clay molds around it in sections, remove those sections, fire them, reassemble them with a hollow space inside, and finally pour molten bronze into that space. When the metal cools, you break away the mold and reveal the casting. The Yellow River Valley Shang elites were doing this with astonishing precision for their ritual vessels. At Sanxingdui, there are signs of a related but locally inflected tradition. Clay mold fragments, negative impressions in the soil, and the internal structure of some bronzes point toward piece mold techniques adapted for these unconventional shapes. On some heads, you can still see faint mold lines where separate sections met. The noses and brows of several pieces look as if they were planned as single units, while the ears, headdresses, or projecting eye tubes were cast either in the same pour with complex core supports, or, possibly in some cases, cast separately and then joined while the metal was still workable. The exact workshop choreography is still being studied, but radiographic imaging has begun to show hollow spaces, core supports, and thickness variations that are very much in keeping with a sophisticated mold-based casting tradition. At the same time, the Sanxingdui workshops were not simply copying Shang recipes. The alloys are broadly comparable, bronze with varying mixtures of copper, tin, and lead. But the surface treatments, the joining methods, and the choice to pour such large, open, mask-like structures suggest a local tradition that had grown up around different priorities. One way we can glimpse those priorities is in what is missing. Look closely at the top surfaces of some of the bronze heads. You'll see small holes, rectangular slots, or irregular patches that do not obviously belong to facial features. On certain pieces there are clear socket-like recesses or broken stubs rising from the crown. Around some mouths or chins you find tiny perforations in orderly rows. Along mask edges there are a series of cast loops or punched holes that could have taken cords. None of these details on their own prove anything. Metal can crack. Casting flaws can look suggestive. But when you have repeated patterns, holes placed symmetrically where a headdress might attach, stubs in positions consistent with eyebrows, moustaches, or crests, loops along edges where textiles or leather thongs could have been tied. The possibility that these bronzes once wore additional layers becomes hard to ignore. Organic materials rarely survive well in the humid, acidic soils of the Sichuan basin. If wood, lacquer, feathers, hair, leather or fabric had been attached to the bronzes, only the most unusual preservation conditions would leave traces. At Sanxingdui, that means we mostly see the armatures, the durable, metallic skeletons that once carried something brighter, softer, more ephemeral. Some researchers have suggested that at least a few of the life-size heads were originally mounted on wooden bodies, dressed in real clothing, perhaps even given wigs or headdresses of fibre and feather. The giant masks may have been front plates on tall wooden poles or frames, turning them into towering presences in a ceremonial ground. In some cases, gold foil fragments found nearby seem to match the contours of bronze surfaces, hinting that parts of these faces were once gilded, catching and reflecting light in ways the bare metal cannot any longer. All of this remains interpretive. We cannot reconstruct the full spectacle, but the physical evidence, the sockets, the perforations, the attachment points, points quietly toward a world where bronze was not the final layer, but the foundation. Set against this, Shang bronzes from the Yellow River region feel like members of a different branch of the same family. Shang ritual vessels favour dense surface-covering patterns, spirals, animal masks and geometric motifs that wrap around tripod cauldrons, wine containers, and bells. Faces, when they appear, are often embedded in decoration rather than dominating it. Proportions stay closer to human or animal norms. Eyes do not typically jut out like tubes. Ears are stylized but not elongated to shoulder length. The whole aesthetic leans toward controlled complexity, pattern layered on pattern. Sanxingdui's bronzes share the same broad technological world. High tin bronzes, mould-based casting, a focus on ritual rather than utilitarian objects, but they push the expressive possibilities in a different direction. Where Shang bronzes feel like texts you read across a surface, Sanxingdui's masks and heads feel like presences you confront. This is why, when the pits were opened in 1986, so many scholars described the faces as alien or other, even as metallurgical analysis and radiocarbon dates anchored them firmly in the same late 2nd millennium BCE Bronze Age horizon as the Shang. They remind us that even within a shared technical tradition, bronze casting, piece moulds, ritual assemblages, there was room for radically different ideas about what a ritual object should look like, and what kind of gaze it should turn back on the people who approached it. If the faces are the first thing that seizes your attention at Sanxingdui, the gold is what keeps pulling your eye back. Mixed in with the broken bronze heads and masks, archaeologists found thin sheets and fragments of hammered gold. Some of them are almost like second skins, gold foil masks large enough to cover the front of a bronze face, cut and shaped with openings for the eyes, nose and mouth. Others are smaller appliques, strips and plaques that seem to have been tacked or tied onto something else, possibly wooden frames, leather backings, or the bronzes themselves. The workmanship is precise but not fussy. You can see careful hammering, consistent thickness, deliberate folds along the edges, sometimes simple incised lines marking out eyebrows or contours. In a few cases, the curvature of surviving gold foil corresponds so closely to specific bronze masks that it is hard to escape the conclusion. At least some of those glaring faces once shone, literally with a skin of gold. In the late 2nd millennium BCE, in this part of Sichuan, that is remarkable. Gold was not yet the everyday elite material it would later become in some parts of Eurasia. It is soft, difficult to mine in quantity, and useless for tools. To cover large surfaces in gold foil implies not only technical knowledge, how to hammer and anneal it without tearing, but also access to enough raw metal that you can afford to beat it thin and then bury it. Some of the most discussed finds are partial gold masks roughly 20 to 30 centimetres across, with cut-out eyes and noses that do not quite match any one bronze face. They may have been freestanding ritual objects in their own right, or interchangeable coverings applied to different supports. Smaller gold ornaments, spirals, rings, plaques with simple patterns, turn up clustered near heads and along the zones where wooden or textile elements would have been. We do not know where Sanxingdui's gold came from. Sichuan has placer deposits, and river gravels can carry native gold, but the volumes implied by hundreds of grams of foil and ornaments suggest either rich local sources or long-distance trade. Either way, these are not the choices of a poor, isolated village. They are the signatures of a community that could concentrate rare materials for purposes that were not practical, but symbolic. Then there are the objects that are hard even to classify with familiar words, the so-called sacred trees. In Pit 2, excavators brought out the pieces of a bronze structure that, when reassembled, rises over 3.5 meters high. It is not a single trunk so much as a vertical axis from which multiple branches spiral outward and upward, each bearing curling offshoots, fruit-like pendants, and bird figures. Smaller examples around 2 meters tall repeat the same grammar on a reduced scale. Central column, tiered branches, hanging elements, perched animals. These are not casual experiments. The main tree from Pit 2 is built in sections: base, trunk elements, branch modules, finial. Each had to be cast separately with its own mould, cooling safely without collapsing under its own weight. The pieces were then fitted together with tenon-like joins and sleeves of metal. In some areas you can still see the seams where branch meets trunk, or the slight misalignment that occurs when heavy components are slotted into place. The scale matters. A freestanding bronze tower over 3 meters tall loaded with projecting arms is an engineering challenge even today. In the late Shang period, in a region without known stone architecture of comparable height, a structure like this would have dominated any space it was set in. It is difficult to imagine it indoors. Most reconstructions place it in an open ceremonial ground, rising well above human heads, its branches perhaps originally decked with something more. Fabric streamers, leaves of another material, or indeed gilt surfaces that are now gone. The imagery itself, tree, fruit, birds, is suggestive but not transparent. Some scholars have compared it to later Chinese myths of a Fusang or sun-bearing tree in the east, or to widespread Eurasian motifs of a world tree linking heaven, earth, and underworld. Those parallels are tempting, but the temporal distance is large, and we do not have Sanxingdui texts to confirm the connection. What we can say is that these trees were major investments of labour and metal, and that they took a form unlike anything found so far in Shang ritual assemblages. Around the bronzes and gold lay things that should not, by rights, have been there at all, at least not in the state in which we can see them today. Sanxingdui's sacrificial pits yielded large quantities of ivory. Some pieces are recognizable as elephant tusks, many of them split, cut, or worked. Others are carved objects and plaques. Radiocarbon dates and contextual evidence suggest they were placed in the pits at roughly the same time as the bronzes in the 12th or 11th centuries BCE. Elephants did once range more widely in China than they do today, including parts of the Yangtze basin. Whether the Sanxingdui ivory came from local animals or from further south, its sheer volume points again to wealth and reach. Ivory is a prestige material, bright, fine-grained, pleasant to touch and to carve. To bury dozens of tusks and carved pieces is to take a significant store of value out of circulation and commit it to whatever purpose the pit served. In most of the Sichuan basin's soils, ivory does not survive well. Acidity and groundwater tend to break it down over time. At Sanxingdui, anaerobic pockets and specific burial conditions seem to have slowed that process enough that substantial fragments remain. Even so, many pieces are cracked, delaminated, or only partly preserved. They are the visible tip of an organic iceberg. For every tusk we can see today, there were likely wooden beams, textile hangings, feather arrangements, leather bindings, lacquered components, maybe even food offerings or human remains that have left little or no trace. The pits contain jades, shells, and other durable items alongside the bronzes, but the patterning of finds, the way certain objects cluster, the gaps and voids between them, suggest that what we see now is the heavy framework of a much richer, more perishable assemblage. This is where interpretation becomes especially delicate. We have bronzes, gold, ivory, jade, and traces of burnt bones and charcoal all together. Some items are clearly broken on purpose. Masks smashed, trees snapped, tusks cut. Others seem intact or were at least reparable before burial. One line of thought sees the pits as primarily ritual, great termination deposits in which valuable ritual gear was deliberately killed and consigned to the earth as offerings to ancestors, spirits, or deities. Another angle emphasizes the political dimension. These were not just sacred objects. They were also instruments of authority, faces of power, symbols of rank, material proofs of a ruling house's right to command labor and distant resources. Burying them could have been a way to close a chapter in that political story, ending a dynasty, marking a crisis, resetting relations with whatever powers were believed to underwrite human rule. The material mix complicates any clean separation between religious and political. Gold foil on a bronze face is both a ritual elevation and a visual statement of hierarchy. Ivory from distant forests mounted on locally cast trees or laid beside local jades speaks to networks that are economic, diplomatic, and symbolic at once. Even the act of breaking and burning, visible in warped bronzes and charred remains, can be read as both a rite of transformation and a calculated display of control over precious things. Preservation adds another layer of uncertainty. Metals and mineralized materials bias our view. We see what endures: bronze, gold, jade, some bone and ivory. We do not see the cloth that might have wrapped the tusks, the wooden screens that may have framed the masks, the painted surfaces that could have tied the whole scene together into a coherent multicolored composition. So when we speak about Sanxingdui's sacred trees, its gold masks, its ivory hoards, we are really talking about the skeleton of a much larger body of practice. Still, even that skeleton tells us something clear. This was a community willing to gather huge amounts of labor and scarce materials, metal ores, gold, ivory, probably exotic woods and shells, and concentrate them in single spectacular installations. Then, at some point in the late 2nd millennium BCE, they chose to take those installations apart, damage many of the components, and bury them carefully. The next question is how? What kind of technical system, what kind of workshops and craftspeople could support this level of production in a place that, until 1986, barely figured in narratives of early Chinese civilization? To answer that, we have to make advanced bronze working a bit less magical and a bit more concrete. Think first about scale. Most Shang bronzes that you see in museums are vessels, ding tripods, ghee bowls, zun beakers. They might stand 20, 40, maybe 60 centimeters tall, with walls a centimeter or two thick. They are impressive, but they are fundamentally hollow containers. Sanxingdui gives us those, but it also gives us something else. Bronze heads the size of a human torso, masks nearly a meter across, upright trees over 3 meters tall with branches projecting out in multiple directions. Some of the larger masks weigh tens of kilograms even in their broken state. The main sacred tree is estimated at several hundred kilograms of bronze when complete, Casting something that big in bronze is not just a matter of building a bigger mould. Metal shrinks as it cools. Thick sections cool more slowly than thin ones. Gravity pulls on soft metal. If you pour too fast, you trap gas and get bubbles. If you pour too slow, the front of the metal starts to freeze and you end up with seams, voids, or cold shuts, where flows meet and fail to fuse. At Sanxingdui, the bronzes show that someone had learned to control all of this. If you look at the heads and masks in section, you see surprisingly even walls. The metal is thickened around structurally vulnerable areas, the bridge of the nose, the bases of projecting ears and eyes, but thinned where weight can safely be reduced. Some ears are hollowed to avoid sagging. The great protruding eyes are cast as separate elements and then joined, reducing the risk that a long, thin cylinder of metal will distort as it cools. That is what advanced means here. A consistent ability to predict how bronze will behave as a hot liquid and as a cooling solid, and to design around those behaviors across an entire workshop tradition. The trees push the same problem further. A 3.5-meter bronze structure is not poured in one go. It is a kit. Each module, base, trunk segment, branch unit, finial, needs its own mould. Each has to be dimensioned so that joints actually fit, while still allowing for shrinkage. Tenon-like pegs must be just narrow enough to slide into their sockets, but not so narrow that they wobble. The branch sleeves must be thick enough to bear weight, but not so thick that internal stresses crack them on cooling. When you see all the pieces slot together and hold, you are looking at an invisible lattice of measurements and mental models. Rules of thumb about how much to overbuild a peg, how wide to leave a sleeve, how far you can cantilever a branch before it will droop or break. No one person intuits all of that from nowhere. It accumulates through dozens, then hundreds, of trial and error casts, preserved as workshop knowledge. That knowledge is expensive. To keep practicing at this scale, the community has to feed it with materials. Bronze is mostly copper. To get 1 kilogram of copper in the Bronze Age, you may need many kilograms of ore plus fluxes plus fuel. Tin is rarer still. Sichuan has copper deposits. Tin might have come from further south or west. Some Sanxingdui bronzes also include lead, which lowers the melting point and improves fluidity, handy when you're trying to get metal into the fine tips of branches or the sharp corners of eye sockets. Every crucible full of molten bronze represents charcoal that had to be made from trees cut, dried, and burned under controlled conditions. Charcoal production itself is a major industry. Woodcutters must go into the surrounding hills, teams must stack and cover the wood. Someone must maintain the slow, low-oxygen burn that turns logs into high-energy fuel without letting them flare into ash. Add to that the labour of mining and transporting ore, washing and roasting it, breaking it into chargeable pieces, carrying it to the smelting site, then moving raw metal again to casting workshops. None of this is work a single household does on the side. When archaeologists talk about resource requirements, they mean exactly this interlocking chain. A corpus of several hundred large bronzes implies not just a few talented artisans, but a community that can reliably mobilize miners, charcoal burners, ore haulers, furnace tenders, mould makers, casters, finishers, and polishers, over years, perhaps generations. Inside that chain, workshops leave their fingerprints in another way: standardization. If you line up Sanxingdui bronzes, you begin to notice recurring forms. The same style of eye shows up on multiple heads and standalone eye plaques: an almond outline, a particular thickness of eyelid ridge, a regular ratio of eyeball diameter to socket width. Ear shapes repeat. The dragon-like or bird-like motifs on vessel handles follow recognizable templates. The segments of different sacred trees share compatible diameters and joint designs. This is not the randomness of individual artisans improvising alone. It suggests model forms, perhaps wooden patterns or master moulds, from which others were copied. It suggests mould-making specialists who know how to build piece moulds around a prototype and then disassemble and reassemble them without losing detail. It suggests that when an elite wanted another mask or another tree, they could ask for one of those, and everyone understood what those meant. A workshop capable of that level of repetition probably had internal hierarchies, apprentices learning to prepare clay, to pack and fire moulds, to file and chase finished surfaces, senior casters deciding alloy ratios and pour temperatures. Some people specialized in modeling faces, others in joining assemblies or repairing casting floors. These are not generalized farmers picking up metalwork for a week a year. They are craftspeople investing their lives in a constrained, technically demanding skill set. And that brings us from metallurgy to society. Copper, tin, and lead do not walk themselves into furnaces. Ivory, gold, and jade do not assemble themselves into composite ritual gear. Somewhere behind the Sanxingdui bronzes there had to be individuals or institutions with the authority to command labour and concentrate resources. In many early states that authority is tied to ritual. The biggest, most technically complex bronzes are not ploughs or weapons. They are things that do not need to exist for survival at all. Masks too heavy to wear in practical life. Trees that cannot provide shade. Vessels too massive for everyday cooking. Their function, as far as we can tell, is to shape space and perception, to materialize relationships between humans, ancestors, spirits, or cosmic forces. If you are the person or group who controls those objects, who decides when the tree is assembled in the ceremonial ground, whose face is multiplied and enlarged in bronze, who has the power to order those faces and trees dismantled and buried, you sit at a strategic intersection. You arbitrate between the world of metal and the world of meaning. That position can justify demands for grain to feed artisans, for woodcutters to make charcoal, for caravans to bring tin from distant hills. The concentration of ritual bronzes, then, is not just a story about aesthetics or belief. It is a visible record of political economy. Who could take the surplus of many villages and freeze it into gleaming, practically useless forms? Because the objects are so striking, it is tempting to jump from, we do not know how they did this, to, perhaps they had help from a lost super-civilization, or from they're unusual for China, to, they must be anomalies in human history. The evidence does not require that. Everything we see at Sanxingdui, large-scale, modular casting, control over wall thickness, standardized motifs, alloy choices tuned to function, fits within what we know Bronze Age communities around the world could achieve when they combined steady access to metal with organized labor and specialized skill. What makes Sanxingdui remarkable is not that its people were impossibly advanced, but that they took the possibilities of Bronze Age technology in a distinctive direction, one that does not map neatly onto the better documented traditions of the Yellow River or the steppe. They were, as far as we can tell, a well-organized society that learned how to move mountains of ore, wood, and human time through a narrow channel of workshops and out into a concentrated field of faces, trees, and ritual gear. Then, at some point, they chose to turn that channel off, to break much of what they had made, and to bury it. To understand what that choice might mean, we have to set the bronzes back into the larger fabric of their world, a world where people could command such resources and skills without yet leaving us a single line of writing. For early China, this is where the story usually becomes clear. In the north, in the late 2nd millennium BCE, the Shang elite begin carving questions into animal bones and turtle plastrons. Will the king's toothache end? Should we attack the enemy to the east? Will the harvest be good? They heat the bones, read the cracks, and sometimes carve the answers as well. Names of kings, names of ancestors, dates keyed to ritual calendars, victories, defeats, eclipses. From those cracked bones and cast inscriptions, archaeologists can build a timeline, roughly who ruled when, who fought whom, which gods received which offerings. Even when the archaeology is messy, the words anchor it. Sanxingdui, as far as evidence currently goes, gives us none of that. Across the sacrificial pits, the surrounding site, and the wider Chengdu plain, there is no confirmed indigenous writing system on the level of Shang oracle bone script or bronze inscriptions. No sequence of signs we can confidently call a royal name. No repeating characters that obviously mean king, ancestor, or offering. No dates we can plug into a table. That doesn't necessarily mean such writing never existed here. It means that so far it has not survived for us to see. If you imagine what writing looks like in a museum, you probably picture hard surfaces. Bone, shell, stone, bronze, maybe clay. But ancient people also wrote on things that rot. Bamboo and wood slips, silk, bark, leather, materials that, in a warm, damp basin like Sichuan, usually return to the soil. Later Chinese texts remember bamboo books as the primary medium of writing for centuries. Even in better preserved northern sites, early wooden tablets usually survive only in waterlogged wells or extremely dry tombs. If Sanxingdui scribes mostly used organic materials, their archives could have dissolved a few decades after being abandoned. The damp earth might still hold fragments in anaerobic pockets no one has dug into yet, or there might be nothing left at all but the faintest chemical ghosts. Writing can also be rare, even when it exists. Early literate societies often restrict formal writing to narrow domains: divination, ritual dedications, high-level administration. The people who know how to read and write might be a tiny specialist class. Most decisions, most commands, most stories move through memory, speech, and practical routines, rather than inked or carved marks. In that kind of world, you can support complex metallurgy, long-distance trade, and intricate ritual without leaving written traces everywhere. You rely on trained officials who remember tax arrangements, on ritualists who memorize liturgies, on chiefs who settle disputes face to face. Sanxingdui could have operated like that. The absence of inscriptions on the surviving bronzes may reflect a choice, that these objects spoke sufficiently through their form and imagery. The mask itself is the statement. A string of characters would be redundant. Or perhaps, in this ritual sphere, spoken formulas and embodied performance mattered more than text. The right words intoned at the right moment, not the right characters engraved in metal. There is also the simple possibility of chance. We know Sanxingdui only through the parts of it we have happened to uncover. 2 spectacular pits in 1986, 6 more in 2020 and 2021, some scattered foundations, burials and artifact clusters, entire palace precincts, storage yards, or administrative quarters may still lie unexcavated under fields and modern buildings. If written records were kept in one tightly bounded complex, and that complex is the very area we have not yet reached, it would be unsurprising that no writing has appeared. Archaeologists have to balance 2 impulses here. On one hand, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We know from many parts of the world that writing can appear suddenly in the record when a new kind of context is opened. A dry cave, a tomb sealed under later construction, a riverbank eroded just enough to reveal a carved stone. It would be premature to declare that the Sanxingdui culture had no writing at all, based only on what we've dug. On the other hand, archaeology has to respect what has not been found. For now, no clear Sanxingdui script has emerged. Despite decades of searching, repeated re-examination of artifacts, and a strong expectation, shaped by the Shang comparison, that some writing might be there. We have to work with the evidence in hand and resist imagining entire archives into existence simply because we want them. The contrast with the Shang record helps explain why this feels so stark. In Anyang and other Shang sites, characters appear exactly where you would expect them from a literate elite, inscribed on oracle bones used in royal decision-making, cast in relief on ritual bronzes that circulate within the court, sometimes brushed in ink on pottery or stamped into jade. Those are durable materials. They endure in the ground for 3,000 years. At Sanxingdui, the durable things are silent. No carved captions on the great masks, no maker's marks naming workshops, no dedicatory text marching along the sides of the trees. If some form of graphic notation did exist here, counting marks incised on wood, personal emblems painted on textiles, tally sticks for managing grain, we have not yet seen it. And it may never have taken the form of a full writing system, one that can encode language at the level of sentences, names, and narrative like Shang script. What would change if we did find that? If a future excavation turned up a cache of bamboo slips in a waterlogged well, or a bronze with a clearly readable inscription, the entire conversation about Sanxingdui would shift overnight. We might suddenly have names for rulers, personal names, ancestral titles, or regnal names that could be compared with legendary figures in later Sichuan traditions. We could have dates of sacrifices, anchoring events in absolute time instead of radiocarbon ranges. We might see how these people described themselves, what they called their polity, their gods, their neighbours. A single line like, "In the 10th year of King so-and-so, we offer this tree to the Lord of the Four Directions," would give us a political structure, a calendar, and a piece of theology in one stroke. A wooden tablet listing grain deliveries from the western villages to a central storehouse would reveal administrative practices and spatial organization. That is the scale of the gap we live with now. Without writing, Sanxingdui remains almost entirely a story told from the outside, from the soil chemistry of its pits, from the styles of its bronzes, from the layout of its buildings, from comparison with better documented neighbours. We can infer hierarchy, ritual, labour organisation. We cannot yet hear how the people of Sanxingdui framed those things for themselves. Paradoxically, that silence is part of what makes the site so compelling. The faces in bronze are vivid. The trees are elaborate. The gold is bright. Everything suggests a community fully capable of abstraction, symbolism, and long-term planning. Exactly the sort of environment where writing often emerges. And yet, in the layers we have touched so far, their words, if they had them, have not stayed. To move forward, we have to lean into that quiet. Resist the urge to fill it with easy stories. Look instead at what can still be seen, in the shapes of buildings and the patterns of offerings, for how a kingdom might have coordinated itself without leaving lines of text. And to do that, we have to look beyond the Sichuan basin and ask how this mute bronze kingdom might, or might not, connect to the better documented world of Shang China to the northeast. If you open a textbook on early Chinese history, the late 2nd millennium BCE is usually labelled very simply Shang. Capitals marching across the Yellow River Plain, lineages of kings with posthumous names, a court that hunts, sacrifices, divines, and drinks from heavy bronze vessels whose shapes and motifs feel almost standardized. The timeline, anchored by oracle bone dates and later records, tends to run in a straight line there. Sanxingdui does not sit neatly on that line. Most of the radiocarbon dates from the main sacrificial pits and associated features cluster, cautiously, somewhere between about 1250 and 1000 BCE, with some scholars preferring a narrower window inside that range. That means that when Shang kings at Anyang were asking their ancestors about eclipses and grain, people in the Sichuan basin were already casting those wide-eyed masks and towering trees. Not later. Not a mysterious, before, roughly contemporaneous as far as our current evidence allows. And yet, when you place a Sanxingdui bronze face next to a classic Shang ritual vessel, the impression is of two very different conversations happening at the same time. Shang bronze art leans heavily toward what archaeologists call the taoti, a kind of composite animal mask, sometimes symmetrical, often built out of curling hooks and abstract scrolls. The eyes stare out, but the rest of the face dissolves into pattern. These masks cling to the surfaces of vessels, ding cauldrons, gui food containers, zun wine beakers, forms that repeat across tombs and centuries with disciplined consistency. Sanxingdui bronzes, by contrast, push outward into the third dimension. Instead of masks as surface motifs, you get masks as objects in their own right. Heads that are almost life-sized or even larger, with projecting ears, pierced for attachments, and those enormous almond-shaped eyes, sometimes extended into literal cylinders. Noses with carefully modelled bridges. Mouths that can be read as neutral, smiling, or grim, depending on the light. The difference is not just visual, it hints at different ritual logics. Shang vessels with their taoti and inscriptions are containers of wine, of meat, of smoke, of the invisible presence of ancestors. They sit between human and divine, mediating through offering. The bronze itself holds something. Sanxingdui pieces feel more like presences than containers. The great masks with inlaid eyes, the standing figure more than 2.5 meters tall holding a lost object, the branching trees with birds and small figures perched on their limbs, these seem to stage a scene. They create a vertical axis between ground and sky, between human height and something far above. One tradition makes its bronzes a kind of sacred tableware. The other builds an entire cast bronze landscape. With such strong contrasts, it can be tempting to declare Sanxingdui completely separate, a lost civilization sealed off behind mountains, developing in isolation while Shang China unfolds somewhere else. That story is emotionally satisfying. It gives the site an air of total otherness. But the geography and the technology both push us toward a more entangled picture. Look at a map. The Sichuan basin is ringed by mountains, but it is not a closed bowl. To the northeast, river systems eventually link to the Han and then to the Middle Yangtze. To the east, the Yangtze itself flows out through the three gorges, toward what would later be densely settled regions. Trails and passes wind through highlands into what are now Shanxi and Gansu. None of these routes would have been easy. But over generations, people, ideas and goods can move along very difficult roads. We already know that bronze technology does not stay put. Wherever the first experiments in alloying copper with tin took place in East Asia, by the late 2nd millennium BCE, we see broadly shared understandings. How to control furnace temperatures, how to use piece molds or section molds, how to model complex shapes in clay and reproduce them in metal, how to manage large foundry teams. At Sanxingdui, the metallurgical signatures, high tin bronzes for certain objects, leaded alloys for others, use of casting cores and composite molds, fit comfortably inside that larger horizon. The people of the Chengdu Plain were not reinventing metallurgy from scratch. They were participating in a shared technical world, then pushing its possibilities in directions that suited their own ritual aesthetics. You can imagine how that sharing might work without requiring direct caravans from the Shang royal city. Intermediate communities along the Yangtze exchange jade, salt, lacquer, timber or exotic stones. Metal objects travel as prestige gifts or bride wealth, moving one social step at a time. A specialist bronze worker from a valley 200 kilometers away marries into a Sanxingdui lineage or is captured in war and put to work at a new foundry. Someone sees a certain mold-making trick and adapts it, not to copy a taoti vessel shape, but to realize a wholly different vision. a tree whose branches can be cast in segments and then assembled like a puzzle. Archaeologically, there are hints of such corridors. Shards of ceramics in the Chengdu plain show affinities to styles further east and north, though not identity. Certain jade forms, Kong and B discs for instance, appear in Sichuan contexts in ways that suggest either import or close imitation of traditions with roots in the Yangtze and beyond. There are also bronzes elsewhere in southwest China whose motifs or manufacturing details resonate with Sanxingdui, implying regional networks that do not line up neatly with the later heartland narratives. So when we ask whether Sanxingdui was connected to Shang China, we may be asking the question in too simple a way. If by connected we mean ruled by Shang kings, or directly copying Anyang vessel types, then the current evidence points toward no. The Sanxingdui repertoire of masks, trees and human figures is distinct. The absence of Shang-style inscriptions, especially ancestral names framed in the characteristic rectangular cartouches, suggests a different way of linking humans to the divine and to the past. If by connected we mean sharing in the broader flows of technology, raw materials, and perhaps some broad religious ideas, then the answer tilts toward yes. Bronze itself, the idea of investing enormous labour into metal for ritual rather than for tools or weapons alone, the sense that ancestors or spirits can be engaged through carefully timed offerings, these seem to be part of a larger cultural conversation stretching across much of what we now call China. This is where narrative habits matter as much as potsherds and metal composition. For over a century, historians have built early Chinese history outward from the Yellow River, Shang, then Zhou, then the later dynasties, with other regions entering the story when they intersect that main line. In that frame, a site like Sanxingdui appears as an outlier, a puzzle to be explained in terms of influence from the centre or deviation from it. But in the late 2nd millennium BCE, there was no single China with fixed borders and a universally acknowledged core. There were multiple regional polities, some of them literate, some not, some leaving long strings of names, others only mute bronzes in a pit. The Sichuan basin was one of those regions. Its people were not outside the story. They were writing a chapter in a different script, most of which has not survived. Framing Sanxingdui as disconnected from the Yellow River risks turning our lack of texts into a kind of cultural exile. It takes the silence of the bronzes and makes it sound like isolation. A more cautious way to phrase the problem might be this. So far, we do not have clear written or iconographic bridges between the Sanxingdui world and named Shang kings. We see shared technological foundations and long-distance exchange routes that could have carried ideas both ways, but the specific political and religious ties remain opaque. Within that opacity, there is room for many degrees of connection. Perhaps emissaries from the East once stood before those staring bronze faces, exchanging gifts under the gaze of gods neither side fully understood. Perhaps contact was indirect, mediated through chains of smaller communities, or perhaps knowledge of Sanxingdui never reached Anyang at all, even as bits of its metalwork style filtered into nearer valleys. For now, the evidence lets us say this with relative confidence. In the same centuries that Shang diviners worked over hot bones in the north, another sophisticated bronze-using society was thriving in the Sichuan basin. It shared the broad, technical language of Bronze Age East Asia, yet spoke it with a strikingly local accent. To understand what those bronzes were doing, not just how they were made, we have to stay with that regional voice and follow it into the pits themselves. When excavators at Sanxingdui talk about the pits, they are mostly referring to a very specific set of features. In 1986, 2 large irregular pits were uncovered, later labelled Pit 1 and Pit 2, packed with bronzes, jades, gold foils, elephant tusks, cowrie shells and ceramics. After 2019, a cluster of at least 6 more pits came to light nearby. The counts shift a little as new fragments are joined and identified, but we're talking about hundreds of objects, some of them among the most technically ambitious bronzes ever made in Bronze Age East Asia. What matters for understanding them is not just what was in those pits, but how it got there. None of these looks like a trash hole behind someone's workshop. The fills are dense but structured. You get layers of ash and charcoal. You get bones and tusks with consistent orientations. You get bronzes that have been snapped, burned, folded or cut, then laid in overlapping but not random arrangements. You get objects that seem to have been placed in groups or in sequences rather than simply dumped. That pattern is why most archaeologists describe them cautiously as sacrificial pits. Sacrifice here doesn't necessarily mean human victims, though there is ongoing debate about some burnt bone fragments. It means that things of value were taken out of circulation, killed, in a sense, and offered up to something beyond ordinary social life. You can see the logic if you look at the objects themselves. Many of the bronzes show clear evidence of deliberate damage before burial. Mass projections broken off, noses crushed inward, eye tubes bent, trees snapped at branch junctions. Some pieces were exposed to fire intense enough to warp and melt thinner sections, but thick enough that the main structure survives. Gold foils are crumpled or torn, elephant tusks are cut and charred. This does not look like accidental burning in a house fire, where you would expect a mix of everyday debris. It looks like a process. First, an object is used, perhaps for years, as part of rituals in a temple or ceremonial plaza. Then, at some point, it is carefully disabled. The face is blinded. The tree that once formed a vertical link between worlds is broken. The bright surfaces are darkened by smoke. Only after that do they go into the ground. One major interpretation holds that what we are seeing is ritual decommissioning, formal retirement of sacred equipment when a temple, cult, or political order changes. Instead of keeping old divine images around to gather dust, you subject them to a final rite. You burn them, cut them, maybe symbolically kill them, and bury them in a special place. The pit becomes an archive of retired power. From this angle, the careful placement starts to make sense. If you believe a bronze mask is more than metal, if it is a dwelling for a spirit or a conduit for a god, you do not casually toss it aside. Even in retirement, it must be handled with respect, stacked in particular orders, accompanied by other offerings like tusks and jades and shells. The pit itself is part of the ritual script. Another line of thinking sees the pits as responses to a major event. Imagine a political crisis, a flood, a prolonged drought, an invasion, or a dynastic shift we no longer have words for. In the face of that upheaval, a community might stage an enormous one-time offering, gathering a generation's worth of ritual paraphernalia and wealth, and committing it all to the earth. Some of the evidence fits that scenario. The concentrations of material seem to represent multiple previous contexts, different altars, different buildings, gathered and brought together. Radiocarbon dates suggest that the objects span decades of manufacture, but were buried within narrower windows of time. That pattern can be read as a great clean sweep sacrifice, a kind of ritual reset button after crisis. A related idea is temple clearing. Ritual buildings may have been periodically rebuilt on the same spot. When that happens in many ancient cultures, the older floors and installations are buried in place or moved to adjacent pits. At Sanxingdui, the discovery of rammed earth foundations, platforms and activity surfaces near the pits hints at an architectural landscape. Altars, halls, courtyards, now mostly erased. In this view, the pits are not isolated features, but parts of a larger ceremonial complex going through cycles of construction, demolition, and renewal. Because we lack texts, these interpretations remain provisional. but the combination of deliberate fragmentation, signs of burning, and non-random arrangement strongly supports the idea of an organized ritual process, not casual disposal. Some researchers push the conversation a step further and ask what kind of social change might sit behind that process. If rulers changed, if one lineage displaced another, or if an old cult was replaced by a new one, there might have been reasons to neutralize earlier sacred images. Destroying or burying the old gods' faces could be a way of closing a political chapter, while still showing a certain fearful respect. You do not simply smash the old order, you put it away in a controlled, ritualized way. Others wonder whether environmental stress played a role. A run of poor harvests, earthquakes, or shifts in river courses could push leaders to enact dramatic offerings to restore balance. In that context, the burning and burial of precious bronzes, jades, and ivory could be read as a desperate gift to unseen powers asking for a reset of the world itself. None of these scenarios can be confirmed yet. They are structured possibilities, built from patterns in the soil and comparisons to other early complex societies. So archaeologists keep looking for anchors. They look for surrounding architecture, foundations of halls that might have housed the bronzes before burial, courtyards where processions could move, post holes that mark the lines of fences or gateways. They search for altars, raised platforms with ash layers, concentrations of bones, or repeated small offerings that might mark stable ritual spots over generations. They map activity areas around the pits, patches of slag, miscast fragments, and clay moulds that might indicate nearby workshops. Clusters of broken ceramics that could record feasting, paths of trampled soil that speak of repeated movement. Each new feature helps to locate the pits within a living landscape rather than in isolation. The hope is that, piece by piece, a picture will emerge of how ritual, power, and everyday life intersected in this corner of the Chengdu Plain. For now, the pits remain the most dramatic pages we can read from that lost chapter. Their very existence tells us that the people of Sanxingdui felt the need not only to make extraordinary bronzes, but also at some critical moment to hide them, broken, burned, and carefully arranged, where no one was meant to see them again. When people say Sanxingdui vanished, it's easy to picture a catastrophe, a city swallowed overnight, a people wiped out. But in archaeology, disappearance is usually quieter than that. Cultures rarely blink out in an instant. They move, they change shape, they fuse with neighbours, their descendants keep living in the same landscapes under different names. So when we ask why Sanxingdui vanished from view, we're really asking three connected questions. What happened to this particular ritual centre? Where did the people and their traditions go? And why, for so long, did later history seem almost unaware that this world had ever existed? One family of explanations looks first at the land itself. Sanxingdui sits in the Chengdu Plain, part of the Sichuan basin. It's a broad, fertile lowland fed by rivers that branch and braid, carrying silt out of steep surrounding mountains. That kind of environment is generous but unstable. Rivers here have never been fixed lines on a map. Over centuries they swing, split, merge, and sometimes simply abandon their old beds. Several researchers have suggested that something like that may have happened around the time the pits were filled. Core samples and geomorphological studies in the region point to episodes of flooding and river course change in the late 2nd millennium BCE. The exact timing is still being refined, but there are signs that major channels shifted, wetlands expanded or contracted, and parts of the plain went from dry ground to flood-prone lowland in the span of a few generations. If your ritual centre is built on a particular terrace because it sits just right above the water, and then the river decides to move, your calculations change. Fields that used to be dependable might get buried in silt or cut off from irrigation. Access routes could be interrupted. A flood that damages rammed earth buildings and ritual platforms might be survivable once or twice. But if the pattern repeats, the cost of staying climbs. In that scenario, the burial of the bronzes could be part of a long farewell. You hold major ceremonies, you retire the old sacred equipment in a final round of offerings. You mark the closing of a place where humans and spirits had met for centuries, and then, gradually or in a planned movement, the center of gravity shifts. No single layer of mud in the excavations proves this definitively. What we have instead are converging hints. Dates for the pits clustering toward the later activity of the site, evidence that some architecture around them was no longer maintained afterward, and the broader picture of rivers in the Chengdu plain that have not sat still. Environmental stress doesn't need to be a Hollywood disaster to push relocation. A series of slightly worse years can be enough. Alongside these landscape stories sits another set of possibilities, changes in power. Sanxingdui was not just a village. By the time the great bronzes were being cast, it was a major node in a regional system, a political and ritual centre for what archaeologists often call the ancient Shu culture. Centres rise and fall in such systems even without floods. A ruling lineage can lose authority. Trade routes can reorganize. New elites can decide to build their halls somewhere else. When that happens, the people don't vanish. They follow jobs, grain, and ritual obligations. Skills and stories travel with them. About 40 kilometers southwest of Sanxingdui, near modern Chengdu, another site enters the story, Jinsha. Jinsha was discovered in 2001, and its main flourishing seems to fall in the centuries after Sanxingdui's peak, roughly between about 1200 and 650 BCE, depending on how you draw the overlaps. There too we find rich evidence of a complex centre, gold foils with sunbird motifs, jade blades, ivory, bronze artifacts, large building foundations, and a dense concentration of ritual deposits. Some of the imagery and materials at Jinsha echo Sanxingdui strongly. A recurring sun symbol surrounded by 4 flying birds appears in gold at Jinsha, and has visual affinities with motifs from Sanxingdui. Certain jade types, the use of elephant tusks in ritual contexts, and aspects of bronze style suggest continuity rather than rupture. It looks less like a new people moving in, more like a familiar tradition reorganizing itself around a new hub. This is why many scholars cautiously describe Jinsha as a successor center to Sanxingdui. Not a clone, and not a simple, move the city 40 kilometers and keep everything the same, but a place where later Shu elites seem to have concentrated after the Sanxingdui area waned. The challenge is that the handoff is not written down. We don't have an inscription that says, in the year X, because of flood and omen, we moved the altar from Sanxingdui to Jinsha. We work instead with radiocarbon ranges, ceramic sequences, and the distribution of artifact styles. Those data suggest an overlapping period when Sanxingdui was declining and Jinsha was rising, somewhere around the late 13th to 11th centuries BCE. The exact choreography, whether people moved in phases, whether some lineages stayed behind, whether there were political struggles tied to the shift, is still debated. There are socio-political scenarios that could fit this pattern. An internal power struggle might have led a younger branch of a ruling house to establish a new seat, taking control of bronze workshops and ritual knowledge, while leaving older cult places to be ritually closed. External pressure, conflict with neighbours, changes in long-distance trade contacts, or entanglements with the expanding Shang world to the northeast, might have made a new location strategically smarter. In that light, the sacrificial pits could mark not only environmental anxiety, but also political transition, the symbolic end of one configuration of power. Whatever the precise combination of rivers and rulers, by the first millennium BCE the Sanxingdui ritual landscape was no longer an active centre. The faces were underground. The temples, if any survived above ground at all, were decaying. Memory was beginning to do something similar. This helps explain another part of the vanishing, the silence of later texts. When Chinese historians in the Zhou and Han periods wrote about the southwest, they did mention a polity called Shu. But those references are brief, often legendary, and focus on kings with magical weapons or serpentine bodies, rather than on real Bronze Age cities. They do not describe a place covered in towering bronze masks with protruding eyes. They do not list Sanxingdui or Jinsha by name. By the time literate states from the Yellow River heartlands were incorporating Sichuan into their orbit, the old Shu centres had already been through centuries of transformation. Populations had mixed. Material culture had changed. Whatever stories people still told about the age of the Great Bronzes were probably filtered through myth, localized cult, and shifting political needs. Writing itself was never adopted in these centres in the same durable way it was in Shang. If there were records, on perishable materials, in ephemeral local scripts, they have not survived. So from the perspective of later court historians, Sanxingdui's world was not just geographically distant. It was temporally blurred. They saw hills with scattered ruins, local deities, oral tales of ancient rulers, and folded them into broad, often vague categories. The people of Shu, the southwest, barbarians beyond such and such pass. The specificity that archaeologists can now see in the soil never made it into those terse lines of classical text. In that sense, Sanxingdui vanished twice. Once on the ground, as rivers shifted and centres of power moved toward places like Jinsha, and once in memory, as its distinct rituals, faces and stories dissolved into the general haze of ancient Shu in later writing. The bronzes in the pits survived physically, but for more than 2,000 years no one with a brush and bamboo slip seems to have written down what they meant. That long quiet is why, when the masks finally came back into the light in the 20th century, they felt not like familiar ancestors, but like the sudden return of a world that had been carefully and almost completely forgotten. For most of that long quiet, Sanxingdui existed only as layers of soil and faint bumps in the landscape. Villagers ploughed fields over the old walls, dug ponds into the fills of collapsed platforms, and walked past fragments of ancient pottery without knowing that anything unusual lay below. The Shu kings remembered in later legend had already been wrapped in centuries of myth. The older bronze-masked world beneath them had dissolved into geology. This raises a puzzle that sounds simple but is actually deep. How does a major Bronze Age centre, with monumental bronzes and large engineered earthworks, fade almost completely from collective memory? Part of the answer is technological. Sanxingdui left us no robust written record, no inscriptions in bronze, no carved stone stele, no archive of fired clay tablets. If there were notations on bamboo, wood, or cloth, they've decayed. If there were local scripts scratched onto soft materials, they have not yet appeared in the excavations we have. By contrast, the Shang world along the Yellow River wrote on bone and shell and cast short texts in bronze. Those inscriptions survived fire, flood, and time. They could be copied, commented on, and woven into later histories. Writing acted as a bridge over centuries. Sanxingdui did not build that kind of bridge. Another part of the answer is political. As power in the southwest shifted toward new hubs, eventually toward centres that would be absorbed into Qin and Han state systems, the old Shu capitals became irrelevant to the concerns of later courts. Historians in those courts were not trying to reconstruct a full, balanced record of every past culture. They were writing to explain and legitimize their own present, their kings, their rituals, their borders. In that narrative, places outside the main political line of descent often appear only when they collide with it, as enemies, allies, or curiosities at the frontier. Sanxingdui's great days were already centuries in the past by the time literate officials from the northeast began to push into Sichuan. What they saw were different towns, different elites, different cults. The memory of an earlier bronze-masked ritual centre, if it survived at all, would have been localised and fragmentary, spoken in dialects the court chroniclers did not hear. And then there is simple, slow burial. Rammed earth walls erode into low ridges that look like natural levees. Pits fill in, level out, and vanish beneath new sediments. Over generations, people forget that a certain field edge follows the old line of a city wall. They stop telling children why a particular knoll has an odd name. Local stories thin, fray, and eventually snap. For archaeologists, that combination, no enduring texts, political shift, and deep burial, is almost a recipe for anonymity. And for a long time, China did not have the kind of archaeology that could reverse it. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, what we might call modern scientific archaeology was just beginning to take root in East Asia. Early excavations were often rescue digs or treasure hunts, focused on objects rather than on carefully recording context. In Sichuan, far from the main centres of early archaeological training, work was sporadic. Bronze artefacts from the region did surface, through tomb looting, chance finds, or local collection, but they tended to be judged against a Yellow River template. If they didn't match Shang or Zhou styles, they were often labelled as barbarian curiosities, interesting but marginal. It took decades for methods and mindsets to shift. By the mid-20th century, Chinese archaeology had begun to systematize surveys, stratigraphic excavation, and typological analysis of ceramics and bronzes. Researchers started to recognize regional sequences and to see that peripheral areas had their own deep histories. In this new framework, the Sichuan basin was no longer just a distant theatre, visited occasionally by northern states. It was a candidate cradle in its own right. The first clue that something big lay at Sanxingdui surfaced in 1929, when a farmer digging a ditch reportedly came across a cache of jade and stone artefacts. Some pieces entered local collections. A few eventually reached scholars, who noted that they didn't look like standard Central Plains finds. But the broader picture remained blurry. Political turmoil, war, and limited resources meant that systematic excavation on the scale needed to understand a buried city had to wait. It wasn't until the late 1970s and early 1980s that larger surveys and test digs began to outline the footprint of a substantial Bronze Age settlement near the village of Sanxingdui. Rammed earth walls, cultural layers rich in pottery and small bronzes, and indications of a centre that was clearly more than a village. Even then, no one had seen the faces. That changed in 1986. When workers extracting clay near the site struck the first of the deep sacrificial pits, and archaeologists were called in. The initial finds already suggested a major deposit, dense broken bronzes, jades, and ivory. But as excavation went deeper, the scale and character of the bronzes became startling. Masks over 1/2 metre wide with exaggerated eye sockets, human-like heads with huge protruding tubular eyes, a towering bronze tree over 3 metres tall, figures with outstretched arms, intricate crowns, and a style of casting that simply did not fit the familiar Shang and Zhou canon. Sanxingdui went, almost overnight, from a regional archaeological site to an international headline. Part of that impact came from the objects themselves. They were visually unlike anything most viewers associated with ancient China. Part came from the timing. By the 1980s, there was growing global interest in early civilizations beyond the classic centres, and Sanxingdui slotted neatly into that curiosity. But another part of the impact was shaped in museums. When the bronzes were conserved and put on display, curators quite naturally emphasized the most striking pieces. The large masks, the tall trees, the enigmatic human figures. Exhibitions leaned into the sense of mystery. Titles and captions spoke of enigmatic faces, lost kingdoms, and civilizations erased from history. Those phrases captured public attention. They also did something subtler. They framed Sanxingdui less as one node in a complex Bronze Age landscape, and more as an almost cinematic anomaly, a strange, forgotten world suddenly blinking into view. This is where it helps to be careful with language like erased. Were the people of Sanxingdui deliberately written out of history by later states? At present, there is little evidence for a systematic campaign of suppression in the way we might imagine it today. What we do see is a structural silence, a culture without durable writing, a region that fell outside the main corridor of the histories that survived, a set of ritual practices that did not feed directly into the textual traditions that later scholars copied and commented on. In that sense, Sanxingdui was not so much erased as never properly inscribed, at least in the archives that endured. The pits themselves may have been a kind of intentional withdrawal, a decision by local elites to bury their most powerful ritual implements beyond normal reach. But the forgetting that followed seems to have been gradual and unplanned, the cumulative effect of environmental change, shifting power, and the biases of who gets to write. What 1986 did was not to reverse a single act of erasure, but to punch a hole through that long-layered silence. Since then, the story has continued to change. Excavations in the decades after the initial discovery refined the layout of the site, traced city walls and identified workshops. The find of Jinsha added another piece to the puzzle of how Shu centers shifted over time. And beginning in 2019, a new round of work uncovered additional sacrificial pits, numbered 3 through 8, with hundreds more bronzes, gold artifacts, and fragments of yet more elaborate figures and trees. These new pits complicate earlier assumptions. They suggest that the practice of massive ritual burial at Sanxingdui was not a one-off event, but part of a longer, perhaps episodic tradition. They broaden the range of imagery, hint at new combinations of human, animal, and cosmic motifs, and provide more material for dating and technological analysis. With each pit, the outlines of Sanxingdui's world grow a little clearer, and, in some ways, stranger. The long forgetting is over, but the process of remembering is only just beginning. To see how these new finds are reshaping our picture of the bronze faces and the people behind them, we need to look more closely at what the latest pits contain, and at the questions they force us to ask all over again. When archaeologists announced, around 2020 and 2021, that 6 new sacrificial pits had been identified and were being excavated at Sanxingdui, it felt less like a sequel and more like a quiet reopening of the original mystery. Pits 3 through 8 sit only a short distance from the famous pair dug in 1986, but they come to us with tools, methods, and questions that simply weren't available 40 years ago. Instead of a single dramatic season followed by years of conservation, the new work has unfolded as a carefully staged research project, with teams of specialists cycling through climate-controlled shelters, taking samples, scanning layers, and trying to read meaning not just from objects but from how, where, and in what order those objects entered the ground. That change in approach matters. The first 2 pits were astonishing, but they were also in some ways archaeological snapshots. We knew that huge quantities of bronzes, jades, gold and ivory had been deliberately broken, burned and buried. We did not fully know how that sequence unfolded, how the pits related to nearby buildings, or whether they represented a single extraordinary event or a recurring ritual pattern. The new pits are beginning to supply that missing context. Pit 3, for example, is smaller than the early giants, with a different mix of objects and less intense burning. Pits 5 and 6 are shallow, packed with gold foils, bronze fragments and ivory. while Pit 8 is large and deep, with layered fills suggesting multiple episodes of deposition. When you line these up stratigraphically and compare soil layers, charcoal bands, and artifact clusters, a rough choreography starts to emerge. You can begin to talk about stages. Perhaps there was an initial phase where certain bronzes and jades were carefully placed, followed by burning that altered some surfaces but left others intact. Perhaps later generations reopened the ritual space, added new offerings, and sealed the pits again. Links between specific pits and nearby rammed earth foundations may indicate that some deposits were coordinated with the construction or abandonment of particular buildings. This is the kind of granular sequencing that only becomes possible when you have multiple pits, carefully excavated within a mapped architectural landscape. The quantities involved are also reshaping the scale of the discussion. By the early 2020s, reports from the new excavations were mentioning on the order of thousands of individual artifacts and fragments, hundreds of bronze pieces, large numbers of gold foils and ornaments, worked jades, painted wooden elements, and vast quantities of ivory. Among them were more human-like heads and masks, additional bronze tree components, animal figures, and objects that do not yet fit any known category. Some of the newly reported bronzes appear to extend known types, masks with slightly different eye forms, heads with new headdresses, bases and fittings that may once have supported tall standing figures or complex ritual assemblages. Others introduce surprises like miniature altars, hybrid creatures, and shapes that suggest textiles or wooden structures now lost. At one level, these finds help fill in gaps. A fragmentary piece from 1986 suddenly makes more sense when a near-complete counterpart turns up in Pit 3 or Pit 8. You can see how arms attached to torsos, how crowns fitted onto heads, how tree branches locked into trunks. Broken lines of imagery become whole again. At another level, the new material breaks open neat categories. Motifs we thought we understood, like the large staring eyes, show up in new configurations combined with birds, dragons, or mountain-like forms. Objects we had classified as purely ritual begin to show wear patterns suggesting repeated handling or display. The boundary between cult image, offering, and status symbol blurs. Here is where improved conservation and scientific testing come in. In the 2020 to 2021 campaigns, bronzes are lifted with surrounding soil intact, moved into lab-like spaces, and gradually exposed under controlled conditions. This allows for microsampling, tiny bits of metal for metallurgical analysis, residues from surfaces for organic testing, and precise charcoal fragments for radiocarbon dating. Metallurgical studies can trace ore sources and alloy recipes, telling us whether different pits drew on the same production networks, or whether each event tapped distinct workshops or trade circuits. Residue analysis on bronzes, ceramics, and soil can, in some cases, detect traces of plant oils, pigments, or even foodstuffs, hinting at what was poured, painted, or placed on these objects before burial. Radiocarbon dates from different layers within the pits and from associated structures can tighten the chronology. Instead of placing Sanxingdui's peak somewhere broadly between about 1200 and 1000 BCE, we may eventually be able to see whether the great pit burials clustered within a few decades, or whether they were distributed across generations. These kinds of tests do not just add numbers to a timeline. They probe the relationships between ritual, economy, and environment. Whether ivory offerings spike in a period of increased elephant hunting, whether changes in alloy composition line up with shifts in trade routes, whether episodes of intense burning correspond to broader climatic events. It might be tempting to imagine that each new pit, each new analysis, will push us closer to a single, clean story about who the Sanxingdui people were, what they believed, and why they buried their bronzes. What the recent work is showing, however, is almost the opposite. As contexts become clearer, they also become more differentiated. Instead of one monolithic sacrificial pit ritual, we begin to see a sequence of related but distinct performances, evolving over time, intertwined with political changes we can only dimly perceive. Instead of one Sanxingdui style, we see workshops experimenting with forms, combining local traditions with influences that may have travelled from the north, the south, or along river corridors we have yet to fully map. The new pits answer some long-standing questions. They confirm that massive ritual burial was not a single outburst, but a recurring practice. They strengthen the case for Sanxingdui as a sustained, complex centre, not a brief flare of Bronze Age extravagance. But they also multiply the questions. Why do some pits emphasise gold foils while others foreground large bronzes? Why do burning patterns differ? Why do certain motifs cluster together, then disappear? And how do these shifting ritual choices relate to the rise, transformation, and eventual eclipse of this bronze-masked world? To approach those puzzles, we have to bring Sanxingdui into conversation with its neighbours, and with the better documented traditions along the Yellow River. That means stepping back from the pits themselves and asking how this Sichuan centre fits, or refuses to fit, within the wider map of early Chinese civilization. So where does all of this leave us? With a landscape that is richer in detail than it was in 1986, but still dominated by three enormous simple questions. Who were these people, really? What did the bronze faces mean to them? And why, at some point in the late 2nd millennium BCE, did they choose to end this ritual world by breaking, burning, and burying so much of it? The first question, identity, sounds straightforward, but it isn't. We can say that the Sanxingdui community was part of the broader Shu cultural sphere in the Sichuan basin. We can say that their bronzes, jades, and gold work show connections to other sites in the region, like the later Jinsha, and that their dates overlap with the late Shang dynasty, around the 12th to 11th centuries BCE. But were they a single kingdom, in the way later Zhou texts describe states? A cluster of allied towns sharing rituals and artisans? A lineage centre whose ritual prestige far exceeded its political reach? Right now, the evidence allows all of those possibilities. We do not yet have their own words for themselves. We have no inscriptions, no royal names, no lists of ancestors carved into stone. All we have are patterns in material, where workshops cluster, how prestige goods circulate, how architectural platforms relate to the pits. Those patterns suggest hierarchy and organisation. They hint at elites who could command labour, concentrate ivory and metal, and coordinate large formalised rituals. But they stop short of spelling out titles, offices, or a clear political structure. Then there is the question of the faces. When you look at those great staring bronzes with their exaggerated eyes, hooked noses, and occasionally almost mask-like stillness, it is natural to want a single answer. These are gods. These are kings. These are shamans in ritual regalia. The difficulty is that each of those answers can fit some of the evidence, but none of them comfortably fits all of it. If the masks are ancestors, mounted on poles or structures to preside over rites, that would line up with the importance of lineage in later Chinese ritual life. It might help explain the repetition of certain features, as if specific forebears were being referenced again and again. If they are deities, perhaps embodiments of mountains, rivers, or sky powers, then the large eyes and sometimes inhuman proportions make sense as deliberate exaggeration. They would not be portraits in our sense, but icons intended to make invisible forces visible. If they are leaders, rulers, or ritual specialists, the elaborate headdresses, ear spools, and sometimes individualized traits could reflect courtly status. The combination of human and stylized elements would then mark them as persons transformed by ceremony. And if they are mythic beings, figures from stories we no longer know, then the problem becomes deeper still. Without the stories, we can only guess at why some heads wear crowns that seem to sprout birds, or why certain eyes are enlarged, or why a few faces seem almost serene while others feel tense and alert. The likeliest answer is that Sanxingdui did not draw the neat boundaries we are tempted to use. A god could be an ancestor, a ruler could be semi-divine, a ritual specialist could stand as a living link between humans and a more than human world. A single bronze could embody several layers of meaning at once. The third question is the hardest. Why were the pits created at all, and why in this way? The deliberate breakage and burning, the repeated episodes of deposition, the apparent closure of a ritual landscape. It all looks like something more than simple hiding or hurried abandonment. Some researchers propose that we are seeing a grand retirement of sacred objects, putting them out of circulation when a temple, lineage, or ruling house ended. Others suggest responses to crisis, drought, flood, epidemic, or external pressure, prompting intense offerings to restore balance. Still others imagine political transformation, a new regime that chose to terminate one ritual order and inaugurate another. Each of these ideas carries different implications. A retirement scenario suggests continuity, the same people, the same place, but a decision to put certain practices away. A crisis scenario points to fear and negotiation with unseen powers. A regime change scenario hints at conflict, perhaps even conquest. At the moment, the soil speaks more clearly than any text, and what it says is nuanced. The pits appear to have been used over spans of time, not just in a single panicked episode. Some objects were burned more intensely than others. Some show repair before deposition, suggesting a long life in use. This combination seems more consistent with structured, repeated ritual than with a one-time emergency. Even here, though, why remains an open door, not a settled room. This is where it can be tempting to jump to dramatic answers. You will find claims that Sanxingdui was a lost global civilization, an outpost of some vanished world-spanning culture. Others see Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or even Mediterranean features in the musks and trees, and argue for long-distance voyages or secret migrations. As hypotheses, these ideas can be described, but when we weigh them against the evidence, they become difficult to sustain. Bronze technology at Sanxingdui is advanced, but it fits into the broader arc of East Asian metallurgy. The alloys, casting techniques and tool forms share enough with other contemporaneous Chinese sites to suggest regional development and exchange, not an inexplicable leap. The motifs, too, can be read as part of a local vocabulary. Birds, eyes, mountains, and hybrid creatures that echo imagery found elsewhere in Sichuan and, in different forms, in the Middle Yangtze and Yellow River regions. There is no need to invoke ships from faraway oceans when river valleys and overland routes offer more straightforward explanations. This doesn't mean there was no contact beyond the basin. It simply means that, so far, the strongest lines of connection run along Chinese river systems and mountain passes, not across hemispheres. Responsible scholarship tends to favour the explanations that account for the most data with the fewest unproven assumptions. And that raises a broader point about how archaeology handles mysteries like Sanxingdui. Gaps are not blank cheques. They are prompts for careful, testable proposals. A responsible hypothesis about the faces or the pits does more than tell an interesting story. It makes predictions that certain kinds of objects will be found in specific contexts, that particular chemical signatures will match between sites, that radiocarbon dates will cluster in ways consistent with the proposed timeline. These predictions can be checked as new excavations proceed and as new methods come online. If the evidence fails to match, the hypothesis has to be revised or set aside. In that sense, archaeology is not about filling the silence with whatever we like. It is about listening closely enough that the ground itself can say yes, no, or not yet. Before we go further into what these bronzes might change about early China as a whole, a small pause. If you'd like to drift even deeper into stories like this, there's a book that accompanies this channel, with long-form, quietly told histories designed for late-night listening or reading. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount available there if you'd like to explore more. No rush, and no pressure, just an option if you'd like these kinds of journeys in another format. For now, we return to the masks and the pits, and to a final question. If Sanxingdui is not a lost global civilization, and not simply a regional oddity, then what does it do to the familiar picture of early China? How does a city of staring bronze faces in a mist-filled basin far from the Yellow River change the stories we tell about where Chinese civilization began, and who gets remembered in that origin story, and who, for 3,000 years, was almost entirely forgotten? For a long time, the story of early China has been drawn like a single river. It rises, we're told, in the north, along the Yellow River, with Erlitou, with Shang, with bronze ding vessels and oracle bones and kings who ask questions of turtle shells and cattle scapulae. From there, the river broadens into Zhou, into the Warring States, into Qin and Han. Other regions appear as tributaries, the Middle Yangtze, the southeast coast, the southwest highlands. All are framed as later, secondary, feeding into a core that formed somewhere between modern Henan and Shanxi. Sanxingdui does not fit easily into that map. Those pits in the Sichuan basin say, quietly but firmly, that by the late 2nd millennium BCE, there was not one centre of complex life in what is now China, but several. The North China Plain with its Shang capitals was one. The Middle Yangtze, with sites like Panlongcheng, was another. And in the west, in a humid basin ringed by mountains and cut by the Min and Tuo rivers, there was at least one more, a shoe centre whose elites could command large quantities of copper, tin, gold, jade, ivory and labour. When we place Sanxingdui alongside Shang, the picture shifts from a single river to a braided system of streams. You have multiple regional powers, each with its own ritual system, its own iconography, its own ways of organising people and resources. They may have been aware of each other, they may have traded or fought, but none of them looks like a simple offshoot of the others. Instead of the cradle of Chinese civilization, we begin to see a landscape of cradles, some of which left rich written records, and some of which, like Sanxingdui, spoke in bronze and clay and gold instead of script. For art history, this shift is just as deep. The monumental bronzes from Sanxingdui are not small variations on a known theme. They are an alternate visual language carried to an astonishing scale. In the Shang world, bronze most famously becomes ritual vessel. Ding, Gui, Yu, Zun, their surfaces covered in tightly organised Taoti masks and thunder-pattern spirals. At Sanxingdui, bronze becomes face, body, tree, animal. The surfaces are less densely patterned, the forms more open, the emphasis falling on the sheer presence of a gaze or the vertical rise of a branching trunk. A standing human figure over 2.5 meters tall. Masks nearly 1 meter across, some with protruding eyes that would once have extended even farther in attached components. A bronze tree whose reconstructed height pushes toward 4 meters. This is monumental sculpture in bronze several centuries before the famous life-size terracotta armies of the Qin. The style is not simply primitive or crude compared to Shang. It is different in its priorities. The Sanxingdui faces are not naturalistic, but they are not random. The proportions, the repetition of certain motifs, the combination of sharply incised features with smooth planes, all suggest conventions that would have been legible to the people who made and used them. To place them beside Shang ritual vessels is to realize that early Chinese art did not grow in a straight line from one prototype. but unfolded in parallel, with at least one major branch now only partially visible. The bronzes also change how we think about religion and power in this period. Whatever else they were, the pits at Sanxingdui represent a mature ritual economy. Metal, ivory, jade, and gold do not just appear. They have to be mined, traded, crafted, stored, and eventually taken out of circulation. The decision to break and bury so much prestige material is not casual. It implies authorities, perhaps a court, perhaps a lineage leadership, perhaps priests who could control the flow of powerful objects. Instead of imagining power as something expressed only by building palaces or winning battles, Sanxingdui invites us to see it in the ability to orchestrate spectacle and destruction. To gather hundreds of bronzes, many of them technically complex, some representing what may have been central beings in the community's cosmos, and then to burn, smash, and bury them in formal sequences, is to exercise a particular kind of authority over things and meanings. This is not unique in world history. Other ancient societies from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica sometimes buried or broke sacred items when temples were rebuilt or regimes changed. But in the Chinese context, where so much of our early evidence comes from Shang divination archives and Zhou ritual texts, Sanxingdui adds a different emphasis. It shows a tradition where power may have been displayed less through inscribed proclamations and more through controlled appearances and disappearances of charged images. Seen from this angle, the core mysteries we have been circling take on slightly new shapes. The absence of writing at Sanxingdui is still striking. We know that Shang, several hundred kilometers away, was using a sophisticated script by this time. We have a few scattered symbols from Sichuan that might be proto-writing or emblematic marks, but nothing that can yet be read as continuous text. This does not mean the Shu elites were illiterate in a simple sense. They may have used perishable writing media, or a script that has not yet been recognized. They may have relied more heavily on oral transmission. For now, their own names for themselves, their gods, their lineages remain out of reach. The deliberate burial of the pits remains deliberate. The long forgetting of the site, its erasure from later texts, is still puzzling. But placed within a landscape of multiple regional centres, that forgetting becomes a little less absolute. Many early polities in China left only faint echoes in later records, or were folded into legendary geographies under new names. The Shu kingdom that appears in Zhou period sources, with its own kings and rituals, may be a descendant of the Sanxingdui world, or a successor that remembered parts of it. The silence is still real. It is simply not unique. What Sanxingdui offers, then, is neither a neat alternative history nor a solved puzzle, but a broader frame. We can say, with reasonable confidence, that early Chinese civilization was more regionally diverse than the traditional Yellow River-centered narrative suggests. We can say that at least one of those regions developed a monumental bronze art that followed its own rules and a ritual system in which destruction and burial were as important as display. We can say that writing, as we currently know it from Shang, is not the only possible medium for complex religious and political life in this time and place. Beyond that, there is more we may learn. Ongoing excavations at Sanxingdui and nearby Jinsha continue to uncover new objects and contexts. Advances in residue analysis, metallurgical study and isotope tracing may clarify trade routes and resource control. Future finds may yet reveal inscribed items, or at least recurring signs that edge closer to readable patterns. Comparative work with other Sichuan sites may help situate the bronze faces within a longer Shu tradition. And beyond even those concrete hopes, there is the uncertainty itself. Not as a failure, but as a space where our usual stories have to soften and make room for lives not yet fully legible. A reminder that the past was once present for people who did not know they were early Chinese civilization, who simply built, worshipped, feared, and hoped in a mist-filled basin under the gaze of tall bronze faces. In the final part of this journey, we will stay with that feeling a little longer. We will look at what it means to live with an incomplete past and why, in the case of Sanxingdui, the things we do not know may be as quietly important as the things we do. So we end here, not with an answer, but with a set of faces that keep looking back. In this one site, in this one basin, we have a cluster of questions we can't quite put down. Who first imagined those vast bronze masks, with their long level eyes and measured mouths? What stories wrapped around the standing figure whose hands now grasp empty air? What words were spoken when the pits were opened, when the ivory burned, when the bronze softened and the gold was torn away and laid down in the ash? The evidence lets us say some things carefully. We can say there was a powerful community in the Sichuan basin between roughly 1200 and 1000 BCE, able to organize large labor forces and long-distance exchange. We can say their ritual life centered on images unlike those in the Yellow River world, and that these images mattered enough to be destroyed in ordered ways, not discarded as trash. We can say their story does not fit neatly as a side branch of Shang, and that early China was already a tapestry of overlapping centers rather than a single line. Beyond that, we are still in the realm of possibilities. Connections to Shang, to later Shu, to other southwest cultures remain partly drawn in pencil. The reasons for the pits, the logic of their burial, the cause of Sanxingdui's disappearance from later memory, are all still open to future spades, future labs, future conversations. That openness is an invitation. If you'd like to keep following these kinds of quiet mysteries, you can help this channel grow by tapping like, leaving a comment, and subscribing. If you feel comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is as you reach this part of the story. It's always a small wonder to imagine all the different rooms and nights that these old questions drift into. If this journey through Sanxingdui and deep time has been soothing, you might also enjoy a longer, slower dive into other prehistoric secrets. There's a book that expands on some of these themes, wandering through vanished worlds, climatic bottlenecks, and forgotten peoples. You can read more about it, or pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, the excavation lights are off. The archaeologists have gone home. Far below the modern fields and roads, the remaining bronzes rest in the dark, the metal cool, the expressions unchanged. They have already waited 3,000 years. They can wait a little longer, until the next careful trench is opened, the next brush moves a layer of soil, and new eyes, yours, mine, someone else's, pause again in the quiet and wonder who, exactly, these people were, and how much more of their world still lies just out of reach.